Thank you very much, and thank you so much to EXPO Chicago for the invitation and for the possibility to actually make this unrealized project of Harry Hu interview today realized. And please again join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Art Green, to Gladys Nilsson and Karl Wirsum. Now, before we start, I wanted to say a few things just about my interview project and this sort of oral history, actually, of contemporary art, which I've been recording sort of over the last 19, 20 years, and so far it's about 2,700 hours. And in a way, this project is very, very connected to Chicago, because the first time I came here, I met Stats Terkel, the great oral historian, and in a way, he became really a mentor for how to do an oral history. He really advised me in many different ways how to make the project more systematic, how in a way also to not only make actually conversations with individual artists and architects, because I had until then only done these one-to-one conversations, but actually to try to achieve portraits which are maybe more complex of subject matters or groups. And it's really through this conversation with Stats that at a certain moment we started to think, you know, could one make a portrait of a movement? And then we did with Rem Koolhaas the book on the Japanese metabolism. More recently, I did a whole series of conversations with all the members of the Zero group in Germany, and it was always an unrealized project to do the same thing with the Harry Hu. So obviously, this cannot happen all in one day, so it's a process. A first conversation already happened with Jim Nutt, which was published a few months ago. Today is now chapter 2, and then hopefully will be followed by chapter 3 with the other members of the Harry Hu group. Interesting is also, I think, the absence or presence of Dom Baum, who as a curator was, of course, very instrumental in bringing this group together, or at least making the exhibitions happen. And so I think it's interesting in terms of very often curatorial history, there is a kind of an amnesia, so it would be interesting to hear more about him. And Eric Hobsbawm always said, the English historian, that memory is very important. And in a way, we live in an age where there is more and more information, and it's maybe not because we have more and more information that by necessity we also have more memory. Rem Koolhaas once said that actually it might be that amnesia is very much also at the stake of the digital age, and for this very reason, Eric Hobsbawm said it's actually very, very urgent that we protest against forgetting and work every day about sort of dynamic forms of memory, which is of course what the interview project in this sense is about. So I thought it would be very nice to begin with the beginning, and maybe even sort of you meeting, sort of go back to the very, very beginnings. And I wanted to ask the three of you if you could tell me about how you came to art, or how art came to you, if there was an epiphany.
Well, for me, I seem to be always drawing. Even when I was very young, I would have a little card table set up in my living room at home, and always have equipment on it so that I could draw. I was madly in love with cutting out paper dolls. I never played with them. I just cut out all the clothes, which I look back on with fond memory now, since I'm working in collage and I'm cutting out a number of little teeny tiny things and re-amalgamating them. But I was always drawing. In grade school, I was drawing. I went to the junior school at the Art Institute a couple of times before getting out of grade school, and was involved with doing classes there. So it was a given for me that I was going to segue right into art on a more substantial basis.
And Art, what about you?
Well, I came to art in a circuitous fashion because my family was not interested at all in art. My dad was an engineer, and my mother made quilts, which is a form of art. But I liked to draw, and I got to be known as a guy that you could give a quarter to so that he would draw something you wanted to see. But my career path was set by my family, which was to be some kind of an engineer. I know there were long conversations whether to go to Indiana or Purdue, whether to go to civil or mechanical, and I had no talent for mathematics, as it turned out, and my dad started a little print shop on the side, and I got interested in graphic design. And then I had an art teacher in school who emphasized the practical things you could do with art. And I like to draw, so I thought I'll go to that. And he talked about industrial design, and I was interested in designing cars, as was every other male kid of a certain age in Indiana at that time. And my teacher encouraged me to apply to art school, and he said, you got to go to the best. Go to the Art Institute. And they had a program in industrial design, I guess, and they had a program in graphic design. But in the first year, we all took the same courses, little 6-week courses in the first term, exploring different aspects of art, but not of industrial design or graphic design particularly. And I got more and more interested in art, but I didn't know anything about it. I couldn't tell Monet from Cézanne, you know, I didn't even know the names. And I gradually got interested. My favorite artist at the end of the first year was Bernard Buffet. And I gradually woke up and met people who were serious, and I got interested in de Chirico and Magritte, and here I am.
Okay. How to follow that? I guess I'll go back to when I was before 6 o'clock. Before I was 6, I had a fractured skull that I needed to be put in the hospital for about a month so the fracture would seal up. And during that time, my father each day would return after working as a print press person, and he would deliver me a narrative series of works that had a kind of a comic strip kind of format, but that relayed some stories of elves and their various proceedings in the forest. And since there was pre-TV, there was TV invented, but at that time they didn't ensconce it into the individual rooms, and so I was left to my own devices, which was kind of following that pattern of drawing and doing my own drawings and kind of showing my father what I had done during the day then we kind of exchanged drawings, so to speak, and I would look at his elven comic strip and he would look at my drawings of the day. And so that really kind of started me off, and like art, one of the doctors, Art suggested, one of his instructors said, got to go to the Art Institute. And so I had not reached the stage where I was ready for graduate studies at the Art Institute, but he suggested the Saturday classes at the Art Institute, which Gladys also attended, and Sue Ellen as well. And they offered these free classes for kids, from 6 to high school. I'm not sure what the range was, but I knew it was 6 because I was there at 6. And so that was my starting point.
Now, when we spoke with Jim Nutt in New York about sort of his beginnings, he mentioned, of course, the importance of Chicago, the importance of the amazing paintings at the Art Institute, and this idea of going back and back and back again. And when I read interviews with the three of you, it also appears a lot, this idea. Gladys, you mentioned the Seurat story, and I mean, the three of you keep mentioning important works in the Art Institute. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about important early encounters with art. I mean, for Jim it was El Greco, so I was curious for who it was for you, and also your teachers, because Jim said the other thing which was so important was actually teachers like Whitney Halstead, who sort of opened him the eyes for kind of non-Western art.
Well, that was pretty much true for me too, that Whitney Halstead taught art history. He took over from Catherine Blackshear, who was teaching the overall survey classes in art history that we took for the first 2 years. And then Whitney would take over from a variety of classes in art history, and he would have specialized things, like he would teach a class on Impressionism, and then he would teach a class on architectural, Gaudi, or then he would teach a class on art in the Congo, and then he had a class in Dada and Surreal, and he had so many classes that he had notebooks, and they would rotate the classes, so you'd have to wait around maybe for 2 years to get into the class that you wanted to take. And I liked art history so much that in 4 years I took about 5 years worth of it just because I couldn't get enough. And Catherine Blackshear worked on the Helen Gardner Art Through the Ages book that was one of the first ones to really encourage looking beyond Western art for stimulus and interest, as did Whitney following through. And he would assign problems that would take us down to the Field Museum, and we would be in the bowels of the museum standing in front of cases of African art and pre-Columbian art, just kind of looking at forms and shapes and lines and colors, and that was a great influence. Also, back in the day when we were going to school, the museum was more likened to what it was when it first was built. It was an old museum in that smaller, and the school itself was in the basement of the museum at the back. And you could come in through the front of the museum, and if anybody has gone around the front hallways on the second floor, there's these wrought iron staircases going upstairs on either side. And there were classes up there. They had 2 and 3 floors where you could go up there, and there was an etching class, and there was a design class, and there was drawing class, and so on. So we were a privileged group of people that could go into the museum before it opened. Either if we had a class in the front, if we didn't, we walked through the museum to the back entrance of the school inside the museum. You couldn't stop and linger and crawl around in the various rooms, but you could kind of absorb art and paintings through the corner of your eye. And I think that made a big difference for me in terms of being able to experience art on that kind of basis.
Yeah, and it gave you the opportunity to see work over a period of time, and your ideas change, and my ideas certainly changed during that time, and largely because of some special teachers, Vera Burdick, in my case, who used to get these plates that were used in making page proofs for Time magazine and Life magazine from somebody at R.H. Donnelly and Company. And she would sit in the corner and scrape away parts of them and then emphasize other parts, and they turn into something very personal, even though it was an article about Claire Booth Luce or something, And she would pass out those plates to students and work on those. And she was a big inspiration. Ray Yoshida was a teacher who I first met in a drawing class, one of those 6-week classes, and he threw one of the students out of the room bodily because they didn't bring the materials. But he was a force to be reckoned with. But when I started in silkscreen, I wanted to take silkscreen, being practical from Indiana, make some money here. And I thought I could make T-shirts or signs or, something like that. And during that first term, we never did anything practical at all. He said, let's see what we can do with the screen. Try drawing it with lipstick and then squeegeeing the loop through it and see what comes out. Well, about 10% of the lipstick comes out, and that's about it. Well, let's try it with pencil. Let's try it with mustard. And it was insane. I thought, this man is nuts. But what he was really on about, and what he kept emphasizing, well, what are you gonna draw? What interests you? And that was what the whole class was about. And if he'd offered a class, what interests you, I wouldn't be interested. But I got into it. And then in the second term, okay, now I'll show you how to make a silkscreen. And he was a great influence. And also Thomas Capsalis, who had third-year drawing. And we had a model, I don't know if she's here, Claire. And she was formerly a ballet dancer and no longer had a ballet dancer's body, but she wore a tutu. And she would stand at the beginning, and Mr. Capsalis always wore a coat and tie, stood at the side, and this woman would talk about the pose she was going to take. This pose has a long history, and she would go into it, and how much percentage the weight is on this leg, and how much on that. And Mr. Capsalis just stood at the side. And then I remember one day after she gave one of her little 10-minute lectures about the pose, he said, class, I'd like you to think of heavy furniture when you do this drawing. And one day he just passed out crackers and said, de Chirico drew in crackers, and that was it. But he would bring in books that would inspire you and just what you needed to see. And so it was, well, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for them, to say the least.
Carl, what about your inspirations?
Well, at the school there, Gladys briefly mentioned Kathleen Blackshear, and I, being a little bit older, I think had more exposure to her. She taught history of art and comp crit, which was divergent from the history of art, where she showed slides and went through the history of art, and the emphasizing the non-Western art, the ethnographic field museum access that we could have at any time that we so chose. But she also had this comp crit class where she had an assignment with basic things like line and as one example, where you would kind of do something just using line, et cetera, et cetera. So this was, this contact with her presentations in the slide lecture class kind of brought enthusiasm to me in terms of the aspect of another form of art that was not, had the kind of design and fantastic kind of imagery that a lot of ethnographic things do present in terms of their masking and just their kind of body paint kind of thing. And so for me, it was a connection to things that I enjoyed in terms of the I originally went to the Art Institute as a graduate from the high school to develop a kind of aspect into being a comic strip artist or a comic book artist, and I saw kind of allegiance in some of the Mesoamerican and ethnographic, the Japanese prints that kind of saw another opportunity for exercising a graphic style of work.
Now, one thing I was very curious, because we spoke about your beginnings, is to maybe talk now a little bit about the beginnings of the Harry Who and how, because you met all through the Art Institute. I think you met very early on and then a bit later with Karl. And I was kind of very curious because speaking to Jim, he sort of was mentioning that maybe the Harry Who were not against, they were not kind of like an anti-movement. Because in '94, I spoke to Leon Golub about Monster Roster, the sort of generation before you. And it was actually kind of amazing because during our interview in his studio, the radio announced the death of Clement Greenberg. And obviously, Leon, it became very clear how much the Monster Roster was a kind of a movement against abstract expressionism. It was anti-New York. And Jim said sort of Harry Who wasn't an anti-movement. Can you tell us a little bit what it was and how it all began?
Well, Don Baum would have these large shows that he would curate at the Hyde Park Art Center. And they would, I can't ever recall that there were a one-person show or a two-person show, but there could possibly be just a series of group shows where everyone would have one piece in it and it might have 30 or 40 people of generations. It wasn't just specifically limited to, it can only be the older, more mature painters or so on and so forth. He delighted in hanging things next to one another that might be virtually student work and then someone that had been painting for 60 years and enjoyed seeing that combination. Being kind of young artists interested in trying to let people see what we were doing. Jim and the two Jims and I, but mainly the two Jims, would sit around and put together lists of the younger artists and maybe some of the older artists too that they thought would be very interesting together. And they were all groups of 5. So Jim and I had been teaching little junior kids classes at the Hyde Park Art Center on Saturdays, so we would be there quite a bit, and we'd quite often see Don, aside from at openings, where it wasn't very good to see anyone if you wanted to remember what anyone said. But in any case, we came one day, and Jim presented him with all these lists with the idea that if you had a show that encompassed less people, they could have more work, so that a viewer could get more of a handle on what exactly it was you might be all about. So Don said that was a really good idea, and he was very, very amenable to looking at what people suggested. If they had an artist that they liked, to go and look at it, and so on, and just like to hear other people's ideas. So he looked at these lists of 5, and he picked the one that Jim and I were a part of, and then he picked another group and said, I think Karl would look good with you, and 6 is a better number than 5. And that's, kind of how that happened. But we were all of various degrees. Karl was a year, 2 years. You graduated...
61.
61. I graduated in 62. Jim was floating around, and the other people were more like, 64. So we were kind of spread out. I didn't know anybody other than the 2 Jims. Obviously, I was married to one of them, and then Faulkner. But Jim, my Jim, knew Art and Sue Ellen. Sue Ellen and Art knew Jim Faulkner, and no one knew Karl, as I recall. But we were all very familiar with Karl's work. So we met Karl at the first meeting that we had of what turned out to be the first Harry Who show. And, it was a great deal of trepidation to open the door, and here was Karl Wirsum, whose work we had known for years and liked, and ta-da! Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where we stood on it.
I had seen a show of Karl's at the Sedgwick Gallery, I think, which is on the 2nd floor near the Sedgwick L station, North Avenue. And there's a curve in the track where, as I recall, maybe I've exaggerated, but the train comes right at the gallery window, and then at the last minute turns. And then on the wall were these paintings that come at you right at the last minute, and it really hit me. It was an exciting moment in my life. And I had also met Karl in the mornings, and I hope people get this straight because I've been misquoted on this. Yeah. I would meet him in the cold winter mornings going to school, and I didn't wear a hat, and this sort of vaporous steam would rise from the top of my head, and Karl always pointed out to me that I should wear a hat because the heat is escaping from the top of my head. But I admired Karl's work, and I'd gotten to know your work and the rest of the people through. There were a series of shows. These were not high concept shows at the Hyde Park Art Center. There was the animal show, the vegetable show, the mineral show. But everybody would enter them, and there'd be a respected juror, and you didn't have to have had a degree or anything, but people with degrees and senior artists and junior artists all entered, and it was meaningful, and they had great openings. They had a gin punch that was created by the ladies who supported the gallery. This was a gallery that was supported by the patrons who kept it going and turned a blind eye to when it fell apart and kept it going no matter what. And, they didn't always have to have fundraising auctions to, can you give us some paintings so we can keep this going for another week? And they had this gin punch that makes all of the happen there a vague memory.
All right, wow. I've recently discovered, not too long ago, about 2 or 3 years ago actually, that wearing hats is not, you don't lose that much heat. So this is not why I'm wearing a hat. I don't know. And the question was just in terms of the beginnings of the Harry Who. Was that the question? Yeah.
Beginning.
Well, again, Gladys, I think, perfectly described the origins there, and that I was late comer to the the game and the first meeting. I mean, I did know Art, as Art described. We did have various encounters. I remember being in several cars and packed cars, like packing clowns in a circus, where you see how many clowns get in a car and going to some party or something. So I do remember Art from that period of time. I don't recall telling him to put a hat on, but if he so designates, I'll go with that. But I do recall him, and I do recall seeing in a small gallery space Jim and Gladys's work on North Avenue.
Old Town Art Center.
The Old Town Art Center, yeah, right. And, being, engaged by their work for sure. And I'm not sure if you're talking, Art, about the silk screen. You did something with ellipse or something that, that I'm remembering maybe incorrectly, but I did see your work in some location somewhere that reminded me of the Magic Kiss lip sign, but it may have been false memory. Yeah.
Now, when groups kind of come together, often there is obviously different versions later on how the name was found. It's kind of interesting with the Zero group. There are all kinds of different memories and recordings. The dictionary played a role where they all of a sudden saw the word zero. I was kind of wondering if you could tell us how the name was found. A lot has been written about. It would be great to hear it from you, and if you have the same memory about this.
Well, my memory is we had all of these meetings, which were usually late at night because everybody had responsibilities during the day, and for the most part, everybody was there. And there would always be a general bit of discussion about what else was going on in the world outside of our door, art world outside of our door, until we got down to business, which quite often could have had Art reading from the phone book because he had such a melodious voice and we loved to hear him so much. And we would discuss the radio show, art radio show reviews and articles and just thoughtfulness by Harry Boris, who would be on WFMT, whether he was on every night or once or twice a week or some such thing like that. And you may have come late to the meeting, or you were there, and the rest of us were saying, "Oh, did you hear what Harry said? This, about this, such and such." And so, "Oh yeah, oh Harry, blah blah blah." And suddenly, and this was during the time when we were trying to figure out a name. We didn't have a manifesto. We didn't have a sense of order of where we were marching. It was not anti. It was not pro. It was just a group of artists that wanted to show their work. But we decided we could have a name, and it should be an interesting name if possible, and we couldn't come up with anything. And during this time, we were talking about Boris and his show, but only referring to him as Harry. And suddenly Karl said, "Harry who?" And we all burst out laughing, and lo and behold, it was the perfect name for us. That's the way I remember it.
So we changed it to Harry with an I, so to protect the innocent. But
that's pretty much it. I mean, but Studs Terkel, who was referenced as a mentor to you, I listened to him in the mornings and never listened to Harry Boris in the evenings. So I was tuning in to FMT, but connecting up to Studs Terkel. So it could have been Studs Yes or something. But Gladys's reference is pretty accurate. That I felt embarrassed. I didn't want to. That I wasn't in the know. Everybody else knew who Harry was, and I was clueless. And so I withdrew my question that was burning in my mind, and I finally did blurt it out, Harry who, and everybody thought, "Whoa, this is it. We're at a loss here. Time is getting late. Let's come up with this as a title." And as Art said, put an I there, and take the innocence, make that anonymous who it was referred to.
if you had been talking about Studs Terkel, we probably would have been the Studs Who, because we would have said Studs Who.
Yeah, because you weren't listening in the mornings, and I was. Okay.
I didn't know you were a morning person, Karl.
Well, I'm not, actually, but Studs helped me wake up, I think.
Little could I know that we talk so much about that circle. That is amazing. Now, when we spoke to Jim Nutt, he actually mentioned the importance of these 3 books and 3 exhibitions. And it's very interesting how actually the Harry Hu history is connected to the 3 exhibitions. And I thought it would be nice that you maybe talk us through these 3 exhibitions. And I thought, because it's the 3 of you, maybe you could each tell us about one of them. And I thought maybe we could start with Gladys, tell us about the 66 show. When we talked to Jim about it, he says that a lot of energy went into the book and into the poster, and that the exhibition was dense and rather chaotic. What are your memories of it?
Well, it's always chaotic. But 66, now looking back on it, a group or a person doesn't have a show every year for 3 years running. I mean, that's just outrageous if you stop and think about it now. But we didn't, and we did, and so there we are. 1966, the Hyde Park Art Center was in the lobby of what used to be an old hotel. So it was kind of shabby looking in one sense, although very functional, and they had back rooms where they had classes in after hours. I can't remember necessarily how many works we did have a piece. It turned out to be more than 4 or 5, as I recall. And it was very straightforward in terms of hanging this group of work. We didn't hang them all in, like, oh, here's Karl, and here's Gladys, and here's Art, etc. But it was all mixed because one thing didn't fit into another space, and how it is when you hang your house. Something doesn't look good hanging next to something else, and you just kind of find the placement. We decided that it would be kind of fun, since we all like comics, and fun is the operative word, if instead of pushing for a catalog, which would be unheard of, that we would have a show catalog in a sense, sort of quasi thing, and use the comic book form, which Don was amenable, and I think, I can't now remember, they had funds, and it probably didn't cost as much as one would have thought it might have cost at some point, so they were amenable to publish comic books. And the show was very well received. It was exciting because it was the first time that there had been something of this nature that had been going on in the space. And what Art was saying was that the Art Center was very, very well supported by generous benefactors and enthusiastic collectors, that they really liked the fact that this place was in Hyde Park, and it was very active, and everybody just loved being there. And the show was a huge success. We arrived not knowing if there would be 2 people in there, and it was jam-packed. In Leslie Bookbinder's film, Harry Hu and the Chicago Imagists, which is for sale at a table over there, and it's well worth the price. You could pick it up. She has shots of either stills or something of what these openings were like, and they were just, you couldn't fit yourself in. They were so crowded. The first one came and went with a great success, and I think the idea is, well, if this one went so well, we should do another one.
And that brings us to
1967.
And maybe, Art, you can tell us about 67. When we spoke to Jim Nutt, he said, and that's kind of interesting, that the installation became more of a focus. And I spoke to Leonora Carrington some years ago in Mexico City, and she told me how she had installed the ropes, with Marcel Duchamp in the Surrealist exhibition in New York, after he had done the callbacks, as a display feature in Paris. And that brings us somehow to Richard Hamilton, who always told me that we might only remember exhibitions which also invent a new display feature, this idea of invention of a display feature. So I was interested, what was the display feature of the 67 show, and if you can tell us a little bit about the installation, which, as far as Jim said, included Hans Prinzhorn photos and added numbers.
for $10,000. I can't remember exactly what the. I think that installation involved some chewing gum and involved photographs of people.
Were they convicts?
With tattoos or convicts, yeah. And is that the exhibition that we had the display case in as well? No, that was another. I'm afraid I was not very much involved in the installation. I would arrive at the opening, and then I would go away. I'm not the right guy to ask.
Well, your teeth got saved because you didn't have to chew up the chewing gum to apply to the
thank heavens. But
convicts.
The Hyde Park Art Center, as Gladys said, was a very simple place, and things were there hadn't been that many opportunities for people to have this kind of show at all, and it came at a good time because Art Forum had a Chicago correspondent who happened to be Whitney Halstead, and so we got coverage in national magazines. And Franz Schultz wrote an article said that looking at the Harry Hu work was like looking at a garden hose in the melting snow. I never understood that. I've looked at garden hoses in the melting snow, and I can't understand why we were very successful. But, you know, there was no gallery lighting. It was these globes like they used to have in schoolhouses, those round globes that would cast an even pall over everything. And so we really, in the final show, I think we really reached our speed, yeah.
And Karl, maybe you can tell us about that final show.
No,
Jim told me that linoleum played a role in that show.
Right. Well, I think Jim probably could have gone further. The other Jim, Faulkner, matted some of his prints, his silkscreen prints, with linoleum. And my own, I never checked that out, but my own thoughts were that we just, that made the two Jims decided, let's take this opportunity to kind of extend that matting formula that Jim Faulkner had executed and bring it into the larger exhibition space. So that was my thought without any, backup, but I could see the proximity of the silk screens matted with linoleum and how it would kind of coordinate up with the walls, which were then took the former kind of wood paneling wall space and the brick. I don't think we addressed the brick, but just the wood paneling, and put linoleum onto that. And I think that the other aspect is you described 3 shows, but I think, I'm not sure on these dates, but the last showing we had was at 2 different locations, right? Or was that the 4th?
The
San Francisco.
The 68 show went to the San Francisco Art Institute, which was a school akin to the School of the Art Institute.
Right.
And then
Washington.
Washington in '69. And then there was also a show of drawings at the School of Visual Arts in New York, roughly around that time.
Was that Slop from Chicago or no?
No, that was another one.
Another show. Okay.
Yeah.
There was a show called Surplus Slop.
Surplus
from
Slop.
Windy City.
From the Windy
It's a great
City.
name.
Right.
And then, of course, the books, and this great book has come out about the collected Harry Hu publications, 66 to 69. And in a way, it seems that you really collaborated on these books together. I read that Art, you did some letters, and Karl contributed something with balloons. And so it was, can you tell us a little bit about how this collaboration worked on the catalogs and how it all...
I think for me the collaboration was more in coming to terms with how we would display things, like you're talking about, with the display, our focus point. And to me, those meetings had analogous to more comedy kind of things, because there's a lot of laughter and fooling around in effect that corresponded to me like something like Monty Python or something that had this kind of bizarre notion. So for me, I wanted to be, along with being a comic strip artist, wanted to be someone that was on radio and appearing on some kind of comedy program and so I kind of connected up to that. So the actual visual, the only time we really collaborated was in these exquisite corpse, and they were kind of, you were talking about doodling and automatic art, and that was a little bit like that. We had to kind of on site at Jim and Gladys's home or apartment dwelling in the basement, had just we got the sheet of paper out and executed these exquisite corpses, and then I think maybe Jim would ink up the exquisite corpses for publication purposes, but I think those are the only times we really collaborated. That would be my memory, anyway. It may be incorrect.
On drawings, yeah.
Yeah.
Which was a surrealist game, I think, the Exquisite Corpse, and they exist in several forms in a lot of various collections. I think the Bergman collection installed at the Art Institute has a couple of surrealist Exquisite Corpses, which are quite nice.
Yeah, it's a game of chance in a way. But the thing is that we were assigned pages. Our work, although people think of, the Harry Who as a particular style, we were not, we didn't have meetings to say, now we'll do it this way, and if you do it the other way, you're out, or anything like that. We just had pages, and we would do our pages. I was late in the first one, and Jim and Gladys were very concerned about me not finishing them, and insisted they stay overnight for a couple nights finishing my pages. I got them done. So we would ink them, or it was cheap to make a comic book, cheaper than, say, a color catalog, which was totally out of our, but to have a color catalog, which that in a way was, it was a color, something that went along with the show, was a tremendous idea. And according to Dan Nadell, it predated Zap Comics, although it had a different purpose. And Jay Lynch, who's a graphic artist, came by after 2 or 3 of the shows and wanted me to give him $100 to help print a new comic called Bijou Funnies, which was also one of the first they call them graphic novels, but alternative underground comics. And I didn't have $100, but I gave him $10. And so we fell into this in a way because it was a cheap way to make a published thing that was in color. And
we also did the separations ourselves, which cheapened it, using sheets of zip tone, Ben-Day dots, which I remember, as Art mentioned, he was late a lot of times, and we had to get the stuff to the printer, and we had a car, so my Jim was designated to drive this to the printer and so on. And I remember the last night before we were going to take it down, you were still at the house working, and we went to bed, and I didn't hear a thing until the alarm clock went off the next morning. And the minute the alarm clock went off, there was this big whoosh of the zip tone being pulled off from Art still working in the other room. But you finished.
One thing I do recall, actually, in collaboration, in a way, for the posters and for some of the covers, we were looking through Life magazines as well as these muscle building magazines, and we selected some advertisements or something within the magazine, and then we did a kind of riff on that. I know Jim did one of somebody on an ironing board or something, and I did one with that was from a suit ad, and some kind of character moving through the streets and stepping on a pile of shit, and he was $1, and that's what the comic book sold for. So that was one other thing I think we collaborated on.
Now I promised that the organizers that this will not be a marathon. I do, however, have a few last, actually, urgent questions. I thought it would be very, very important because you all, continue to make extraordinary work, and it would be great to hear a little bit what you're working on at the moment in 2015. I'm particularly interested to know also how you relate to the proliferation of media, to the extraordinary explosion of images on the internet, and maybe also the impact, digital technology or the internet has had on your work, or or not? Because obviously, if one looks at the Harry Hu publication, it's clear how much you were inspired by all kinds of publications, cartoons, wrestling magazines, all kinds of things. Hence the question, what is it now and what's happening in 2015? Maybe Gladys, you start?
Well, as far as my interacting with technology, I can barely do email, so that's, and turn the TV set on. That's about as technical as I want to get. Most of my work from the get-go has been working on paper and utilizing mainly watercolor on paper with occasional additives of gouache as time has gone on. From time to time, I've had forays with working using plexiglass as the support vehicle, acrylic on plexiglass, and then I've had occasional forays into doing canvas with acrylic. But for the most part, my work has been, aside from a few 40 by 60 watercolor papers, which is a big paper to heave around, has been a more intimate scale. A couple of years ago, I started to do more drawing, what I referred to as big sloppy drawing, and there were a few examples of this woman sitting in a chair in an arbor with all kinds of things happening around her. So I haven't gone back to doing any straight watercolor for quite a while. I continue to do work on paper utilizing collage, a lot of collage, which goes back to my cutting out paper dolls. And reinventing scenarios of certain things, utilizing art history books. I am bastardizing art history books like mad that I pick up at my friends at the library sale, etc. But I want to reach again in myself and do perhaps some larger things. Might take me a while to figure out how and what. I'm going to pull out some big papers and do some larger graphite drawings. And then walking through museum shows, I think, well, it might be kind of nice to work on canvas again. But I want to do some bigger things that step outside the more intimate nature of the things that I've generally been working on.
I said I was influenced by the surrealists, and I certainly was, and de Chirico, and the idea of opposition within a work, and the waking and the unconscious, and I love finding things I wasn't looking for that turn out to be what I was looking for. I used to go to used bookstores a lot and find old magazines and illustrations. I was interested also in idealized images. I used ice cream cone a lot in my painting, and that happened because I had a studio on Halsted Street, and I used to go out to this ice cream stand, and I noticed there was an illustration of this ice cream cone that I had quite admired. It was very three-dimensional, and then I noticed people coming away from the counter with their ice cream cones they just bought. It had no form, it had no three-dimensionality, it wasn't convincing, it didn't look like the thing in the picture. So it was an idealized, it was like the ice cream cone in the mind of God, and you get this terrible thing. And that really interested me, the idea of how we accept things that aren't what they are. I found tires that had color cascading down them in old magazines for Firestone ads. And I got interested in contrasting that with pictures of people with bad skin conditions in dermatology books, you know. So the two extremes, I seem to be in between the two of them, and I did that for quite a while. And then I got interested in looking at things from both sides and so on, and perspective. I was sitting, waiting for our daughter to have a piano lesson, and a little girl walks down the street, a very, very little girl, and their sidewalk was right next to the street, and I thought, she's going to run in the street. So I'm watching her, and she looked at her mother, she's back a ways, and she turned around, looked back at her mother, who was about 100 feet away, and her face turned beet red, and she started screaming, and she said, "Mommy, Mommy, why did you get so small?" You know, and we've all gone through this, obviously. We've come to terms with a weird situation we're in. And I've always felt that we're in a weird, if not catastrophic situation, and I've tried to bring that to the attention of others through my painting. Anyway, I've done other stuff too, but I'll go on.
As far as my connecting up to some of the digital phenomena, the only real engagement with that had to do when I was, for 2 years, I did some work at the Art to the Nth Degree Laboratory, and the Sandor, I think it's Ellen Sandor, was the head honcho of that, and so Ed Paschke and myself, among some other artists, executed some three-dimensional simulations in 3D that had, if people are familiar with the postcards that you can get on religious themes that have a kind of three-dimensional effect because they have this kind of certain kind of screen that is kind of represented in the postcard, so you get a three-dimensional illusion. So I did several of these, I think it may have been 2 or 3, maybe 3 at the max, of scenes that were three-dimensionally modeled in digitized form and then presented as an illusion because they had some kind of a screen that was set before the two-dimensional image, and then it somehow navigated to this three-dimensional illusion. So I had people working at the Nth Degree Laboratory, and they were helping me out. So I really did nothing but conceptualize, and through my drawings that we kind of negotiated the three-dimensionality of them via their expertise at negotiating the digital phenomena, the digital world, which I had no clue of. So that's the only time I really departed into that area of connecting up with the. Normally, it's just normal, pretty old school kind of situation of drawings and paintings, etc.
I forgot to mention, I do use Photoshop now. This was a big thing. My path went, I had all these rules. If I did a painting, I'd never go back over any area. So it got very exciting as you came to the end, because I like to finish each part as they went, and then the last ones you could really screw it up, because I was not allowed to go back into it. And whenever I had to transfer something, I would use a grid, and that way you could distort it using a grid. And I felt that was very important. It was, a moral issue. And but eventually, I caved in and got a slide projector, and I took slides of things and then project them onto the screen, which seemed to me a transgression, and I would have kept it to myself, and have until this very moment. And then I got an overhead projector, and that was an extremely clunky one with about a 2-horsepower motor, and it weighed about 100 pounds, and it gave you a very dim view. And so I thought, well, the punishment was justified in order to use it. And but finally, I got Photoshop, and I mostly use it just to distort things so that they're in perspective, a different perspective. And I find it very useful. But since it's so easy, I got an overhead projector with it. It's so easy, I've had to increase the drudgery of my painting so that I'm in balance.
Very last question. Jim Nutt, Jim Falconer, Suellen Rocca, and the three of you continue to inspire many, many young artists. So I wanted to ask you this question, Rainer Maria Rilke, a question I often ask, because Rainer Maria Rilke wrote this beautiful little book, which is an advice to a young poet. So I'm kind of curious, what would be your advice to a young artist? When I asked Jim Nutt about that, he said, look hard, stand in front of something that interests you, and really look at it. What would be, in 2015, your advice to a young artist?
Well, that sounds good to me. I think that the only person that should really have anything to say in terms of what you're doing is yourself. that you really have to work and listen to your inner core as to what you should be doing and not anybody else, and just work. Look at things like Jim Nutt said, look at everything, look at, stand in front of a painting, don't look at it, don't pull it up on your computer screen when it's at the museum and you can stand in front of it and love its luxuriousness, and just work. Work hard.
I'm stymied in a way because the situation's so different for a young artist than it was when we were young artists, and that was some time ago. At that time, I don't think any of us were the stars of the school. Did anyone get a traveling fellowship?
No.
That was the sort of litmus test. If you got a traveling fellowship, you'd made it. And generally people went off to New York or wherever. And none of us did. In my case, I had thrown my life away. I was told by family members and people who cared about me by doing this dumb thing. And once you've thrown your life away, there is a certain freedom that comes about. And in those days, we didn't have big debt. Tuition was $250 a term, and you could easily make that in the summer and then get a menial job that would pay. So it cost me $17 a month to have my apartment I was sharing with 3 people. And I thought, well, this is my life. I'll just paint and so on. But I agree. You need a lot of courage, and the biggest courage is to follow your own inner self and pay no attention to the nattering nabobs of theory, etc.
Karl?
Yeah, well, I probably would echo that. I mean, being a teacher, I find that these generalized prescriptions and the aspect of going with your own enthusiasm and not being dissuaded by some kind of temporary formula of approaching art is maybe a good basis. But I think that individually, too, just as a teacher, I find that approaching each student individually and seeing what prescriptions they have, it's hard to kind of make these generalized things, but what has been said prior by Gladys and Art and Jim, as you quoted, this is a good base to work with, I think.
There could not be a more wonderful conclusion. Gladys, Art, Karl, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.